Our Evening Party Among the Mountains by Nathaniel Hawthorne. We stood in front of a good substantial farmhouse of old date in that wild country. A sign over the door denoted it to be the White Mountain Post Office and Establishment, which distributes letters and newspapers to perhaps a score of persons comprising the population of 2 or 3 townships among the hills. The broad and weighty antlers of a deer, a stag of 10, were fastened at the corner of the house. Fox's bushy tail was nailed beneath them, and a huge black paw lay on the ground newly severed and still bleeding, the trophy of a bear hunt among several persons collected about the doorsteps. The most remarkable was a sturdy mountaineer of 6 feet 2, and corresponding bulk, with a heavy set of features, such as might be moulded on his own blacksmith's anvil, but yet indicative of mother wit and rough humour. As we appeared, he uplifted a tin trumpet 4 or 5 feet long, and blew a tremendous blast, either in honour of our arrival, or to awaken an echo from the opposite hill. Ethan Crawford's guests were of such a motley description as to form quite a picturesque group seldom seen together, except at some place like this, at once the pleasure house of fashionable tourists and the homely inn of country travellers. Among the company at the door were the mineralogist and the owner of the gold opera-glass, whom we had encountered in the Notch, 2 Georgian gentlemen who had chilled their southern blood that morning on the top of Mount Washington, a physician and his wife from Conway, a trader of Burlington and an old squire of the Green Mountains, and 2 young married couples, all the way from Massachusetts on the matrimonial jaunt. Besides these strangers, the rugged county of Coos, in which we were, was represented by half a dozen woodcutters who had slain a bear in the forest and smitten off his paw. I had joined the party and had a moment's leisure to examine them before the echo of Ethan's blast returned from the hill. Not one but many echoes had caught up the harsh and tuneless sound, untwisted its complicated threads, and found 1,000 aerial harmonies in one stern trumpet. It was a distinct yet distant and dreamlike symphony of melodious instruments, as if an airy band had been hidden on the hillside and made faint music at the summons. No subsequent trial produced so clear, delicate, and spiritual a concert, as the first. A field piece was then discharged from the top of a neighbouring hill, and gave birth to one long reverberation, which ran round the circle of mountains in an unbroken chain of sound and rolled away, without a separate echo. After these experiments, the cold atmosphere drove us all into the house with the keenest appetites for supper. It did one's heart good to see the great fires that were kindled in the parlour, and barroom, especially the latter, where the fireplace was built of rough stone, and might have contained the trunk of an old tree for a backlog. A man keeps a comfortable hearth when his own forest is at his very door in the parlour. When the evening was fairly set in, we held our hands before our eyes to shield them from the ruddy glow, and began a pleasant variety of conversation. The mineralogist and the physician talked about the invigorating qualities of the mountain air, and its excellent effect on Ethan Crawford's father, an old man of 75, with the unbroken frame of middle life. The 2 brides and the doctor's wife held a whispered discussion, which by their frequent titterings and a blush or 2 seemed to have reference to the trials or enjoyments of the matrimonial state. The bridegrooms sat together in a corner, rigidly silent like Quakers, whom the spirit moveth not, being still in the odd predicament of bashfulness towards their own young wives. The Green Mountain squire chose me for his companion, and described the difficulties he had met with half a century ago in travelling from the Connecticut River through the Notch to Conway, now a single day's journey, though it had cost him 18. The Georgians held the album between them, and favoured us with the few specimens of its contents, which they considered ridiculous enough to be worth hearing. One extract met with deserved applause. It was a sonnet to the snow on Mount Washington, and had been contributed that very afternoon, bearing a signature of great distinction in magazines and annuals. The lines were elegant and full of fancy, but too remote from familiar sentiment, and cold as their subject, resembling those curious specimens of crystallized vapour which I observed next day on the mountain top. The poet was understood to be the young gentleman of the gold opera-glass, who heard our laudatory remarks with the composure of a veteran. Such was our party, and such their ways of amusement. But on a winter evening another set of guests assembled at the hearth, where these summer travellers were now sitting. I once had it in contemplation to spend a month hereabouts in sleighing time, for the sake of studying the yeomen of New England, who then elbow each other through the Notch by hundreds on their way to Portland. There could be no better school for such a purpose than Ethan Crawford's inn. Let the student go thither in December, sit down with the teamsters at their meals, share their evening merriment, and repose with them at night, when every bed has its 3 occupants, and parlour, barroom, and kitchen are strewn with slumberers around the fire. Then let him rise before daylight, button his greatcoat, muffle up his ears, and stride with the departing caravan a mile or two to see how sturdily they make head against the blast. A treasure of characteristic traits will repay all inconveniences, even should a frozen nose be of the number. The conversation of our party soon became more animated and sincere, and we recounted some traditions of the Indians who believed that the father and mother of their race were saved from a deluge by ascending the peak of Mount Washington. The children of that pair, overwhelmed and found no such refuge in the mythology of the savage, these mountains were afterwards considered sacred and inaccessible, full of unearthly wonders, illuminated at lofty heights by the blaze of precious stones, and inhabited by deities who sometimes shrouded themselves in the snowstorm and came down on the lower world. There are few legends more poetical than that of the Great Carbuncle of the White Mountains. The belief was communicated to the English settlers, and is hardly yet extinct, that a gem of such immense size as to be seen shining miles away hangs from a rock over a clear deep lake high up among the hills. They who had once beheld its splendor were enthralled with an unutterable yearning to possess it, but a spirit guarded that inestimable jewel, and bewildered the adventurer with a dark mist from the enchanted lake. Thus life was worn away in the vain search for an unearthly treasure, till at length the deluded one went up the mountain still sanguine as in youth, but returned no more. On this theme methinks I could frame a tale with a deep moral. The hearts of the palefaces would not thrill to these superstitions of the red men, though we spoke of them in the centre of their haunted region. The habits and sentiments of that departed people were too distinct from those of their successors to find much real sympathy. It has often been a matter of regret to me that I was shut out from the most peculiar field of American fiction by an inability to see any romance or poetry or grandeur or beauty in the Indian character, at least till such traits were pointed out by others. I do abhor an Indian story, yet no writer can be more secure of a permanent place in our literature than the biographer of the Indian chiefs. His subject, as referring to tribes which have mostly vanished from the earth, gives him a right to be placed on a classic shelf, apart from the merits which will sustain him there. I made inquiries whether in his researches about these parts our mineralogist had found the 3 silver hills, which an Indian sachem sold to an Englishman nearly 200 years ago, and the treasure of which the posterity of the purchaser have been looking for ever since. But the man of science had ransacked every hill along the Saco, and knew nothing of these prodigious piles of wealth. By this time, as usual with men on the eve of great adventure, we had prolonged our session deep into the night, considering how early we were to set out on our 6 miles ride to the foot of Mount Washington. There was now a general breaking up. I scrutinized the faces of the 2 bridegrooms, and saw but little probability of their leaving the bosom of earthly bliss in the first week of the honeymoon, and at the frosty hour of 3, to climb above the clouds. Nor when I felt how sharp the wind was, as it rushed through a broken pane, and eddied between the chinks of my unplastered chamber, did I anticipate much alacrity on my own part, though we were to seek for the Great Carbuncle.